Silver Grove was the kind of town where nothing ever happened. Sheriff Luke Carter had been patrolling these streets for nearly 30 years, and each day felt more like the last. The roads, the people, the sleepy little stores, they were all the same, as if frozen in time. Silver Grove used to thrive, but now it was like the town had taken a deep breath and never exhaled. Luke's patrol car rumbled down the empty main street, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the stillness. He glanced out the window, the same way he did every night, and let out a sigh. At 55, he was no longer the idealistic young deputy who had signed up for this job, dreaming of making a difference. Now he was just tired. Tired of the monotony. Tired of the same small-town squabbles. Tired of the isolation he felt, even in the midst of his own life. His hand rested loosely on the steering wheel as he drove past the old park. That's when he saw an elderly woman sitting on a bench near the entrance. She was hunched slightly, her face shadowed by a worn-out coat and knitted hat. The sign at the gate read, "Park closes at 9 p.m." It was well past that. Luke slowed the car and frowned. He had noticed the woman a few times before, always after hours, always sitting on that same bench. Tonight, though, something about the way she sat there, so still, so distant, made him pause longer than usual. He wasn't in the mood for another confrontation with a late-night loiterer, but rules were rules. With a heavy sigh, he pulled the patrol car to the curb and stepped out. His boots crunched on the gravel path as he approached her, the night air biting at his skin. "Mom!" he called, his voice echoing in the quiet. "Park's closed." The woman didn't move. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her posture still as if she hadn't even heard him. Luke gritted his teeth, irritation flaring inside him. He was used to dealing with rebellious teenagers or the occasional drunk, but this was something different. "Mom," he said again, louder this time, "you can't be here after dark." Finally, she turned her head and looked up at him. Her face was weathered, her dark eyes calm but heavy with some unspoken weight. She didn't flinch or argue, she just looked at him, her gaze almost gentle. "I know," she said quietly, her voice soft yet firm. "But I have to be here." Luke narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean you have to? The park's closed? You've been here before, and I've let it slide. But this can't keep happening." The woman offered a small, tired smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm waiting for someone." "Who?" Luke asked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Who are you waiting for at this hour?" "My son," she said simply. "Has coming back soon." Luke frowned. He glanced around the empty park, the street beyond silent and dark. "Lady, there's no one coming. It's almost midnight. You need to head home." But she didn't move. "I promised him I'd wait here." Luke felt a wave of frustration rise in his chest. He'd dealt with enough difficult people to recognize when someone was testing his patience. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone sharper now. "Marjorie," she replied. "Well, Marjorie, unless you've got a real good reason to be out here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Luke said, his voice firm. "I'm waiting for Ben," she said again, her eyes drifting back toward the street as if she could see something or someone he couldn't. Luke exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "This isn't a bus stop," he muttered. "I'm telling you, you can't just sit here every night." "I know," Marjorie replied softly, her voice steady. "But I promised." Something about the way she said it, so calm and sure, made Luke pause. There was a quiet strength in her that he didn't understand, and it bothered him. "All right, well, I'm going to have to ask you to move along tonight. If I see you here again, I'll have to take you in for trespassing," Luke said, his voice harsher than he meant it to be. Marjorie nodded, but there was no fear or anger in her face. Just the same calm acceptance. "I understand," she said. Luke turned and walked back to his car, glancing over his shoulder once as he slid into the driver's seat. Marjorie hadn't moved. She was still sitting there, her gaze fixed on some far-off point in the distance. Something about the encounter gnawed at him as he pulled away from the curb, but he shook it off. "Crazy old lady," he muttered under his breath as he drove away, the unease lingering in his chest. The next night, Luke found himself driving past the park again. He hadn't planned it, but his route had taken him there as if drawn by some invisible force. Sure enough, Marjorie was sitting on the same bench, in the same position, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The cool autumn wind ruffled her coat, but she didn't seem to notice. Luke cursed under his breath and pulled the patrol car to the curb. His irritation flared as he stepped out and marched toward her, the gravel crunching under his boots. "You again?" he called out, his voice sharp. "What are you doing here?" Marjorie looked up at him, the same calm expression on her face. "Good evening, Sheriff," she said politely. "This isn't funny," Luke snapped, his patience wearing thin. "I told you last night the park's closed. You need to go home." Marjorie smiled faintly, but there was sadness behind it. "I'm waiting," she said softly. "For Ben?" Luke muttered, rolling his eyes. "Right. Where is he supposed to be coming from Mars?" The faint smile faltered, but Marjorie didn't argue. "Hell come," she whispered almost to herself. Luke stared at her, exasperation bubbling up inside him. He didn't have time for this. "Look, lady, if you don't move along, I'm going to have no choice but to—" "I made a promise," Marjorie interrupted, her voice cutting through the cold night air. "And I'll keep it, no matter how long it takes." Something in her tone stopped Luke in his tracks. There was a conviction there, an unwavering belief that made him hesitate. For a moment he stood there, unsure of what to say. The wind rustled the leaves around them, the night suddenly feeling colder. Luke opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he turned and walked back to his car, his mind swirling with thoughts he didn't want to acknowledge. As he drove away, the unease that had followed him the night before was stronger this time. What kind of mother waits in the cold, night after night, for a son who never comes? By the third night, Luke couldn't ignore the nagging feeling anymore. He had seen plenty of strange things in his time as sheriff, but something about Marjorie's quiet persistence was different. It wasn't just stubbornness, it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. And so, once again, he found himself driving past the park. And once again there she was, sitting on that same bench, her thin coat pulled tightly around her small frame. Luke cursed under his breath as he pulled the car to a stop. He slammed the door harder than necessary as he got out, his irritation boiling over. "This has to stop," he barked as he approached her. "What are you really doing out here? Are you selling something? Waiting for someone to pick you up?" Marjorie turned her head slowly, her expression unchanged. "Good evening, Sheriff." "Evening. It's nearly midnight," Luke growled, planting his hands on his hips. "This isn't a game. You can't just sit here every night." Marjorie's eyes softened, but she didn't move. "I can't leave," she said quietly. "Why not?" Luke demanded, exasperated. "Because I promised Ben," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told him I'd be here when he came back." Luke stared at her, frustration building in his chest. "You keep saying that, but where is he? If he hasn't shown up by now, what makes you think he ever will?" Marjorie lowered her gaze, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Because he promised me too." There was something in her voice, a sadness, a quiet hope that made Luke's chest tighten. He didn't want to feel sorry for her. He didn't want to get caught up in whatever delusion she was living in. "Lady, you can't sit out here every night," he said, softer this time, but still firm. "What are you waiting for? A miracle." Marjorie smiled faintly, but she said nothing. The wind whipped through the park, sending a shiver down Luke's spine. He cursed under his breath and turned away, heading back to his car. As he drove off, the question gnawed at him again. What kind of mother waits this long? The next morning, Luke sat at his desk in the sheriff's office, staring at the case files on his computer screen. He hadn't meant to look into it, really. He hadn't, but curiosity had gotten the better of him. He typed in the name Benjamin Grant. The file popped up, a robbery charge from 20 years ago. Luke skimmed through the details, his frown deepening. 2 witnesses, both of whom had given shaky testimony at best. No physical evidence tying Ben to the crime. Just circumstantial evidence and a confession from a co-defendant who had cut a deal. Luke leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. Something about the case didn't sit right with him. It felt rushed, sloppy, like the department had been more interested in closing the case than finding the truth. He stared at the screen, the image of Marjorie sitting on that bench flashing in his mind. She wasn't just some crazy old lady. She was waiting for her son, waiting for a promise to be kept. And now, Luke wasn't so sure that promise had ever been broken. Luke couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest since his last encounter with Marjorie. The more he thought about her, the more he couldn't ignore the doubt creeping into his mind. The case files sat open on his computer screen, glaring at him, practically begging him to dig deeper. It was a quiet morning in Silver Grove, the kind of morning where the chill clung to the air, a hint of frost glittering on the sidewalks. Luke sat at his desk, staring at the old case file of Benjamin Grant. His fingers hovered over the mouse, unsure if he should click through the rest of the report or close it and move on with his life. He hadn't come to work today to get tangled up in the past, but Marjorie's unwavering belief in her son's innocence gnawed at him. He clicked through the file anyway. The details were vague, the evidence shaky. It was a robbery gone wrong, a local convenience store hit late at night. 2 men were involved, but only one had been caught at the scene. Ben Grant had been arrested weeks later, based on the testimony of a co-defendant who had cut a deal for a lighter sentence. There was no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, just the word of a man trying to save his own skin. Luke leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. It was a flimsy case. He'd seen enough bad arrests in his time to recognize when something didn't add up, but this one felt like it had been swept under the rug far too quickly. The door to his office creaked open, and Deputy Chris Tanner, a young rookie eager to prove himself, poked his head in. "Hey, Sheriff! You good? You've been staring at that screen for a while." Luke snapped the laptop shut. "Yeah, I'm good. Just looking over some old files." Tanner gave a half nod, clearly not buying it, but he didn't push. "All right, just wanted to check in. I'm heading out for patrol." As Tanner left, Luke exhaled slowly, trying to clear his head. He needed answers, but he wasn't sure where to start. Later that day, Luke found himself in front of a modest, aging house at the edge of town. Tom Henderson, his old friend and now a local journalist, lived here. If anyone could help dig into an old case, it was Tom. Luke hadn't seen him much in recent years, but they used to be close before life took them in different directions. Tom opened the door, his eyes lighting up with surprise at the sight of Luke. "Well, well, look who's come out of the woodwork," Tom greeted, motioning him inside. Luke stepped in, feeling the warmth of the house hit him as he walked into the cozy living room. Old photos lined the walls, and stacks of papers cluttered the coffee table. Tom's investigative work, no doubt. "I need a favor," Luke said without preamble, taking a seat on the worn leather couch. Tom raised an eyebrow, leaning against the armchair across from him. "You asking for help? This must be big." Luke sighed. "You remember the robbery from 20 years ago? The one Ben Grant was locked up for?" Tom's expression shifted. He crossed his arms, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Yeah, I remember. It didn't sit right with me even back then." "What about it?" "I think there's something wrong with that case," Luke admitted, rubbing his hands together. "The evidence is thin. The witnesses, well, they weren't exactly reliable." Tom sat up, intrigued. "And you want me to look into it?" "I want you to help me dig. I can't reopen the case officially without raising eyebrows, but if we can find something, anything that points to Ben being innocent, then maybe we have a shot at getting him out." Tom leaned forward, his journalist instincts kicking in. "You really think he's innocent?" Luke hesitated before answering, thinking about Marjorie waiting in the cold every night. "I think it's worth finding out." Over the next few days, Luke and Tom worked in secret. Tom used his journalistic contacts to pull up old interviews, court transcripts, and police reports. The more they uncovered, the more the pieces didn't fit together. The key witness, Jackie Miller, had been inconsistent in her testimony, and there were whispers that she'd been pressured by local authorities to point the finger at Ben. Luke's frustration grew as they hit one dead end after another. Every new detail they uncovered only confirmed his suspicion that the case had been robbed. One night, after a particularly long day of sifting through records, Luke found himself back at the park. The cold autumn air had settled in, the trees nearly bare as the wind swept through the empty streets. As expected, Marjorie was there, sitting on her bench, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. Luke approached her, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "Marjorie!" he called out, his voice softer this time. She looked up at him, her face calm, serene, as if she hadn't been sitting in the freezing cold for hours. "Good evening, Sheriff." Luke sat down beside her on the bench, something he hadn't done before. The wood creaked under his weight as he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I've been looking into Ben's case," he said after a long silence. Marjorie's eyes flickered with the faintest glimmer of hope, but she said nothing, just waited. "There's something wrong with it. The witnesses, the evidence, it's all shaky." I think he paused, trying to gather his thoughts. "I think Ben might have been innocent." A soft, sad smile touched her lips. "I've always known," she said simply, but no one would listen. Luke stared at her, his frustration mounting. How could she have waited this long, believing in something that might never come? And yet, here she was, still waiting, still hoping. Why, he asked, the question bursting out of him before he could stop it. Why keep waiting for him after all these years? What if he never comes back? Marjorie looked at him, her eyes filled with the kind of quiet strength that Luke couldn't understand. "Because I made a promise," she said, her voice steady. "And I know Ben. He made a promise too. He'll come back to me, Sheriff, no matter how long it takes." Luke felt the weight of her words settle on him like a heavy blanket. He had spent so many years going through the motions, detached from everything and everyone. But now, sitting beside Marjorie, he felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The next few weeks were a blur of late-night meetings and hushed conversations. Luke and Tom worked tirelessly, sifting through every piece of evidence they could find. Luke had managed to keep his investigation off the radar of his superiors, but it was only a matter of time before someone noticed. The breakthrough came when Tom tracked down Jackie Miller, the key witness in Ben's trial. She had left Silver Grove years ago, but Tom managed to find her living in a small town a few hours away. Luke and Tom made the drive, both of them tense with anticipation. When they arrived, Jackie looked nothing like the confident young woman from the trial. Time had not been kind to her. Her face was lined with age, and there was a nervousness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice shaky as they sat down in her tiny living room. "We're not here to cause trouble," Luke assured her. "We just want the truth." Jackie looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting anxiously in her lap. "I didn't want to testify against him," she whispered. "But they pressured me. Said if I didn't, I'd get in trouble too. I was young, scared, I just wanted it to be over." Luke exchanged a glance with Tom, the pieces of the puzzle finally starting to fall into place. "So Ben didn't do it?" Luke asked, his heart pounding. Jackie shook her head. "No, he didn't." Armed with Jackie's confession and the other evidence they had uncovered, Luke knew it was time to take the next step. He couldn't keep the investigation under wraps any longer, it was time to bring it to light. But when he brought the evidence to his boss, Captain Earl Reynolds, things didn't go as planned. Reynolds sat behind his desk, his expression dark as he flipped through the file Luke had handed him. "You're treading on dangerous ground here, Carter," he said, his voice low. "I'm doing what's right," Luke replied, his jaw clenched. Reynolds slammed the file shut and leaned back in his chair. "What's right? You think reopening a 20-year-old case is going to help this town? You think digging up the past is going to fix anything?" Luke stared at his boss, frustration boiling inside him. "Ben Grant was innocent, and we locked him away for something he didn't do. That's not justice." Reynolds shook his head. "You're too close to this, Luke. You're going to tear this department apart if you keep pushing." Luke's hands balled into fists at his sides. "So, what, we just let an innocent man rot in prison because it's easier?" Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "This isn't just about you or Ben Grant. This is about this town, this department. You start reopening old wounds, and it's going to get ugly." Luke's heart pounded in his chest. He knew Reynolds was right. This wasn't going to be easy. But he couldn't walk away now, not after everything he had uncovered. "I don't care how ugly it gets," Luke said, his voice firm. "I'm going to do what's right." As he walked out of the office, Luke knew that the battle ahead was going to be harder than anything he'd faced before. Luke left Captain Reynolds' office with a storm brewing inside him. He knew he had just crossed a line, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than his career. It was about justice, not just for Ben Grant, but for Marjorie, who had waited for her son for 20 long years, clinging to hope. For the next few days, Luke and Tom worked around the clock. They submitted a formal request to reopen Ben's case with the new evidence they had uncovered: Jackie Miller's recantation, the inconsistencies in the police work, and the absence of hard evidence. But the resistance they faced was stronger than Luke had anticipated. One afternoon, as Luke sat at his desk, Tom barged into the sheriff's office, waving a piece of paper in the air. "I found something," Tom said, breathless with excitement. "The convenience store owner, Charles Davies, the one that got robbed. Turns out, he died a few years ago, but his family kept the business going." Luke frowned. "What does that have to do with Ben's case?" Tom slapped the paper down on Luke's desk. "I got in touch with his son. He says his dad always believed the wrong guy was convicted. He told the police back then, but they didn't listen. Said the description didn't match Ben at all." Luke's heart skipped a beat. "You're telling me Davies' son says Ben didn't fit the description?" "Exactly," Tom said. "It was all in the original police report, but it was buried under all the other paperwork." Luke stood up, pacing the room. This was the break they needed. "This changes everything." Tom nodded. "I think we've got enough to make a real case here, Luke. But we're going to need someone from outside the department to look at this. Someone who isn't tied up in local politics." Luke knew exactly who could help: an old contact of his who had moved to the state attorney's office a few years back, Lisa Moreno. She was sharp, honest, and wouldn't hesitate to look at the case with fresh eyes. It didn't take long for Luke to get in touch with Lisa. They met at a small diner just outside Silver Grove. Lisa was younger than Luke by a good 10 years, but had risen quickly in the ranks. She listened carefully as Luke laid out everything he and Tom had uncovered. "So, you're telling me that the key witness in the trial has recanted her testimony? The evidence was flimsy at best, and now you've got the victim's family saying Ben didn't even match the suspect description?" Lisa asked, her brow furrowed. "That's right," Luke said, leaning forward. "It's enough to reopen the case, isn't it?" Lisa sat back in her seat, chewing on her bottom lip as she thought it over. "It's enough to get a judge to take a second look, for sure. But reopening a case this old, especially one with a conviction, won't be easy. You know how these things work, Luke. There's going to be pushback." "I don't care about the pushback," Luke replied, his voice steady. "I just want the truth." Lisa gave him a long, searching look before finally nodding. "All right, he'll take it on. But you need to be prepared for this to get messy." Luke exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Messy or not, we're doing this." Over the next few weeks, Lisa got to work. She filed the petition to reopen the case, and soon the story started to spread. The local paper ran an article, and the word reached the wider media. For the first time in 2 decades, people were talking about Ben Grant again. But with the attention came backlash. Captain Reynolds wasn't happy about the negative spotlight being cast on his department, and he wasn't the only one. Luke began receiving cold stares from his colleagues, and some even stopped speaking to him altogether. The pressure was mounting, and Luke knew he was walking a tightrope. Despite the growing tension, Luke stayed focused on the case. Lisa had arranged for a preliminary hearing where they would present the new evidence to a judge. It was their one shot to prove that Ben had been wrongfully convicted, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The day of the hearing arrived. Luke sat in the back of the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest. Tom was next to him, along with Lisa, who was at the front of the room preparing to make her case. Marjorie was there too, sitting quietly near the front, her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't said much since the investigation had gained traction, but Luke could see the hope flickering in her eyes. She had waited for this moment for so long, and now it was finally within reach. The courtroom was packed with reporters and onlookers, all eager to see what would happen. Lisa began by laying out the new evidence, starting with Jackie Miller's recantation. Then she moved on to the convenience store owner's original description, which didn't match Ben at all. Finally, she presented the inconsistencies in the police work, pointing out how the case had been rushed to secure a conviction. The prosecutor tried to fight back, arguing that the original evidence was enough to uphold the conviction, but it was clear that the tide was turning. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable as he took in all the information. Finally, after hours of testimony, the judge called for a recess. Luke, Tom, and Lisa waited outside the courtroom, the tension thick in the air. Marjorie sat nearby, silent but hopeful. After what felt like an eternity, the judge returned to the bench. Everyone filed back into the courtroom, holding their breath as they waited for the ruling. In light of the new evidence presented, the judge began. It is clear that there were significant flaws in the original investigation. Therefore, I am overturning Benjamin Grant's conviction and ordering his immediate release. The words hit Luke like a wave. He felt a rush of relief and disbelief all at once. He turned to look at Marjorie, who was sitting still, tears streaming down her face. She clutched her hands to her chest, her body trembling with emotion. A few days later, Ben was released from prison. Luke stood outside the gates with Marjorie, waiting. The cold wind bit at his skin, but he didn't feel it. All he could focus on was the moment ahead, the moment Marjorie had been waiting for all these years. The gate opened, and Ben walked out, looking older, wearier, but free. Marjorie took a few tentative steps toward him, her hands trembling. When Ben saw her, his face softened, and for the first time, Luke saw a flicker of the young man Marjorie had described, a man full of hope and promise, before everything had been taken from him. "Mom," Ben whispered, his voice breaking as he reached for her. Marjorie closed the distance between them, throwing her arms around her son. They stood there for what felt like forever, holding each other as if the world had disappeared around them. Luke watched from a few feet away, his chest tight with emotion. He had done it. They had done it. Ben was free and Marjorie's wait was over. The days following Ben's release were a whirlwind. The town was abuzz with the news, and Luke found himself in the center of it all. Some people praised him for his courage in reopening the case, while others criticized him for dragging the department through the mud. But Luke didn't care about the opinions swirling around him. For the first time in years, he felt like he had done something that mattered. Ben was adjusting to life outside of prison, and Luke did everything he could to help. He drove Ben to job interviews, made calls on his behalf, and vouched for him wherever he could. It wasn't easy. There were still people who saw Ben as a criminal, despite the overturned conviction. But Ben approached each challenge with quiet determination. Marjorie, too, had changed. There was a lightness in her now, a peace that Luke hadn't seen before. She still came to the park, but now she and Ben walked together, side by side, talking and laughing as if the years of separation had never happened. One evening, as the sun set over Silver Grove, Luke found himself sitting on the same bench where Marjorie had waited for so long. The air was cool, the sky painted with streaks of orange and pink. He watched as Marjorie and Ben walked through the park, their silhouettes outlined against the fading light. A sense of quiet peace settled over him. It had been a long, hard journey, one filled with doubt, frustration, and moments where he thought it would never end. But now, sitting here, Luke felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Belonging. He wasn't just a sheriff patrolling the streets of a sleepy town anymore. He was part of something bigger, something that mattered. And for the first time in a long time, Luke knew that he had made a difference. As he sat there, the wind rustling through the trees, Luke felt the weight of his badge on his chest. But it wasn't the same burden it had been before. Now it felt like a symbol of what he had fought for, a reminder that justice, though delayed, could still be served. Luke smiled to himself, watching as Marjorie and Ben disappeared down the path, their voices fading into the evening air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The weeks following Ben's release brought change not just for him, but for the entire town of Silver Grove. The story of Ben Grant's wrongful conviction had spread beyond the town's borders, attracting media attention and igniting conversations about justice and accountability. For many, it was a reminder that even in small, forgotten places, truth could prevail, no matter how long it took. Luke found himself in the middle of it all. He hadn't sought out the spotlight, but as the sheriff who reopened the case, he became a symbol of perseverance. He received letters from people across the state, thanking him for standing up when others wouldn't. Some days, it felt overwhelming, but in quieter moments, he realized that this was why he had become a sheriff in the first place, to make a difference, even if it meant stepping outside his comfort zone. In the town itself, the mood was different. Old tensions between law enforcement and the community began to heal. Silver Grove had been a town stuck in time, but now there was a sense of movement. People began talking about change, about righting old wrongs, and making sure the mistakes of the past weren't repeated.
One of those changes came from Luke himself.
He didn't want what had happened to Ben to be an isolated incidenta case where they got lucky. He proposed a review of other old cases, hoping to ensure that no one else in Silver Grove had been unjustly convicted. It wasn't a popular idea among his fellow officers, but Luke knew it was necessary. If they could find justice for Ben, maybe they could find it for others too. The town's residents responded in different ways. Some welcomed the idea, while others were more hesitant, unsure if dragging up the past was the best way to move forward. But Luke wasn't looking for approval. He was looking for justice. Luke's relationship with his daughter, Sarah, had been on rocky ground for years, but the events surrounding Ben's case had slowly started to thaw the ice between them. Sarah had been following the case from afar, reading about it in the papers, and watching interviews with Luke on the local news. One afternoon, Sarah called him. "Dad," she said, her voice tentative, "I've been thinking about everything that happened with Ben. I saw the interview you did last week. It was brave what you did." Luke leaned back in his chair, his heart beating a little faster. It had been so long since he and Sarah had had a real conversation. "I just did what I thought was right. I know. I guess I haven't always given you enough credit for that." "For trying to do the right thing," she said softly. There was a long pause on the line. Luke wanted to say something that would fix all the years of distance between them, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, Sarah spoke again. "I was thinking maybe we could get together sometime. Talk. You know, I've been meaning to come visit." Luke closed his eyes, relief and gratitude swelling in his chest. "I'd like that, Sarah. I'd really like that." It wasn't a full reconciliation, not yet. But it was a a bridge slowly being built after years of neglect. For the first time in a long time, Luke felt hope for his family. Meanwhile, Ben was making strides in his own life. Adjusting to life outside of prison wasn't easy, but with the support of his mother, Luke, and the town's newfound willingness to give him a second chance, he was beginning to find his way. One of the first projects Ben took on was the renovation of the old library. The building had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up, its once grand interior now a shell of its former self. But to Ben, it represented something more. It was a symbol of what could be restored, just like his life. With help from Luke and some of the town's residents, Ben turned the library into a community hub. It wasn't just a place for books, but a center for learning and connection. There were computer stations for kids to do homework, classes for adults who wanted to learn new skills, and even a small cafe where people could gather. The transformation of the library mirrored the transformation of the town. It became a place where people from all walks of life came together, where past mistakes were acknowledged but not allowed to define the future. For Ben, it was a way to give back to the town that had finally believed in him. And for Luke, it was a reminder that redemption wasn't just for Benit, was for everyone. One evening, not long after the library opened, Luke found himself walking through the park. The air was crisp, the last hints of autumn clinging to the trees. He hadn't planned on coming to the park, but something had drawn him there, the same way it always had. He saw Marjorie sitting on the bench where she had once waited for her son. But this time, she wasn't waiting. Ben was there beside her, laughing as they talked, their heads bent together as if no time had passed between them. Luke stopped a few feet away, watching them from a distance. He smiled to himself, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over him. This was what it was all about. This was why he had fought so hard to see moments like this. "Hey," Sheriff Ben called out, spotting Luke. "Come join us." Luke hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the bench and sat down beside them. The wood creaked under his weight, but it felt different, no lighter somehow. He looked at Marjorie and Ben, their bond unbreakable. forged in years of waiting and believing. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The park was peaceful, the air cool but not cold. Luke looked up at the sky, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the fading light. "You know," Marjorie said quietly, "there was a time when I thought I'd never see this. When I thought maybe it wasn't going to happen." Luke glanced at her, seeing the wisdom and strength in her eyes. "But you kept believing." Marjorie smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "I had to. I made a promise." Luke nodded, feeling the weight of those words. He understood now in a way he hadn't before. Promises weren't just about what you said. They were about what you believed, what you were willing to fight for, even when the odds seemed impossible. As the months passed, Luke found himself more involved with the community than ever before. He worked closely with Ben at the library, offering mentorship to kids who were on the wrong path, hoping to prevent them from ending up where Ben had. It wasn't the life Luke had imagined for himself, but it felt right. For the first time in years, he had a sense of purpose that went beyond his badge. The town of Silver Grove, once sleepy and stagnant, had found new life. The library became a symbol of that change, a place where people came to learn, connect, and grow. And at the heart of it all were Ben and Marjorie, a mother and son who had taught the town and Luke what it meant to believe in something, even when the world told you not to. Luke stood outside the library one evening, looking up at the sign that now read, "The Grant Memorial Library." It was named not for someone who had passed, but for a life that had been restored, for a future that had been reclaimed. Ben walked out of the building, locking the door behind him. He spotted Luke and smiled. "You heading home, Sheriff?" Luke smiled back. "Just Luke," he corrected, feeling lighter with each passing day. "Yeah, I'm heading home." They walked together down the street, the town quiet but alive in a way it hadn't been before. The cold air nipped at their faces, but neither of them minded. The night was peaceful, and the future, for the first time in a long time, felt bright. In a small town where time seems to stand still, Sheriff Luke Carter has spent years patrolling the same quiet streets, until one night he notices an elderly woman, Marjorie, sitting on a park bench. Night after night she waits, unmoved by the cold, insisting that she's waiting for her son, Ben. But what Sheriff Luke uncovers about Ben's past is more than just a mother's wishful thinking. It's a decades-old secret that could shake the entire town. As Luke digs deeper into the case, he's faced with hard truths about justice, loyalty, and how far one will go to keep a promise. Will Marjorie's long wait for her son end in heartache or redemption? Join us on this emotional journey of hope, redemption, and the power of belief in the last promise. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that will pull at your heartstrings and leave you thinking long after the last word. Let's dive into the story. Cedarville had been through a reckoning, and while the scars would take time to heal, the seeds of change had been planted. And Ethan knew he had a role to play in making sure they grew. The months passed, and Cedarville slowly began to heal. Reforms were introduced to the police department, with new leadership taking over and a focus on transparency and community engagement. The culture that had once allowed officers like Harmon and Jennings to act with impunity was being dismantled piece by piece. Ethan, now fully committed to leading the oversight board, worked tirelessly to ensure that the changes weren't just symbolic. He pushed for real accountability, advocating for body cameras, independent investigations into police misconduct, and better training programs focused on de-escalation and bias reduction. At home, the Davis family found their own peace. Rachel had moved back to Cedarville to be closer to their father, and their once fractured family began to rebuild the bonds that had been broken over the years. The tension between Ethan and Michael had been replaced by a deep sense of mutual respect and love. They had been through the fire, and they had come out the other side stronger. One evening, as the sun set over Cedarville, Ethan and Michael sat on the porch together, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The air was warm, and for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of calm between them. "You did good, son," Michael said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You fought for this town. For our family? Ethan smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. We fought together, Dad, and we made it. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past finally lifted from their shoulders. Cedarville still had a long way to go, but there was hope now, a hope that Ethan knew had been born from their shared struggle. And as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Ethan allowed himself to believe in a future where justice and healing could coexist. The reckoning had come and gone, and now it was time to rebuild. Michael nodded, his gaze softening. "I'm proud of you, you know, for everything you did, for standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. It had been a long time since he'd heard his father say those words. "I couldn't have done it without you. You taught me to fight for what's right, even when the odds are against me." They stood in silence again, but it was a silence filled with understanding. The years of tension and unspoken resentment between them had dissolved in the face of everything they had endured together. They had fought for justice, not just for Michael, but for the community. And in doing so, they had found their way back to each other. Henry would go to the meeting spot as instructed, but Jason and his team would follow closely behind, ready to intervene the moment the scammers made their move. Jason couldn't shake the tension in his gut as they made their way to the designated area. Quiet corner of the airport's parking structure, far from the bustling crowds. As they approached, Jason's senses sharpened, scanning the area for any sign of the scammers. The parking structure was dimly lit, the shadows stretching across the concrete like dark fingers. Henry walked ahead, his steps slow and hesitant, his eyes darting nervously around the empty space. Jason's team moved into position, spreading out to cover all possible exits. They couldn't afford to let the scammers slip away. Then, out of the shadows, two figures emerged. A man and a woman, both dressed in plain, nondescript clothing, their faces obscured by baseball caps. They walked toward Henry, their expressions unreadable, but their body language was tense. Jason's heart raced as he watched from a distance, his hand hovering near his radio, ready to give the signal. He could see the moment Henry realized something was wrong, his shoulders tensed, and his eyes widened in confusion. "This isn't Emily," Henry whispered, his voice shaking. Before the scammers could say a word, Jason stepped forward, his voice ringing out with authority. "Stop, Riverport Security. Stay where you are." The scammers froze, their faces twisting into expressions of panic as they realized they had been caught. Jason's team moved in quickly, surrounding them before they could make a run for it. Henry stood in the middle of the chaos, his hands trembling as he stared at the two people in front of him. The realization hit him like a freight train. Emily wasn't real. She had never been real. Jason approached Henry slowly, his heart aching at the sight of the old man's devastation. "I'm sorry, Henry," he said softly. "I'm so sorry." Henry didn't respond. He just stood there, his face pale, his eyes hollow. The love he had believed in, the hope that had kept him going for 2 long years, had been shattered in an instant. The scammers were led away in handcuffs, their plot foiled, but the damage had already been done. Jason stayed by Henry's side, his heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. He had done everything he could to protect the old man, but it hadn't been enough to stop the heartbreak. Henry looked up at Jason, his voice barely a whisper. "It was all a lie, wasn't it?" Jason nodded, his throat tight. "I'm afraid so, Henry? But you're not alone. I'm here, and we'll get through this together." Henry's eyes filled with tears, his body trembling as the weight of the betrayal finally sank in. Jason reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. For now, all Jason could do was stand beside him as Henry's world crumbled around him. The next few hours felt like a blur. The scammers had been arrested and were being processed by local authorities, but Jason's focus was entirely on Henry. After the confrontation in the parking structure, Henry had grown quiet, retreating into a shell of shock and despair. His shoulders sagged under the weight of the truth, and his eyes were filled with a hollow sadness that made Jason's heart ache. As they sat together on a bench back in the terminal, Jason didn't push Henry to talk. He knew that right now, the old man was grappling with the reality that everything he had believed in for the last 2 years had been a lie. The woman he had fallen in love with didn't exist, and the money he had worked his whole life to save was gone. Henry sat with his hands resting on his lap, his fingers nervously twitching. Every now and then, he would glance down at his phone, as if expecting another message from Emily, but there was nothing. Jason stayed by his side, offering quiet support as the minutes stretched into an uncomfortable silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Henry spoke. "How could I have been so stupid?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "I gave her everything and it was all a lie." Jason's throat tightened as he heard the raw pain in Henry's voice. He leaned forward, his voice gentle. "You weren't stupid, Henry. These people are professionals. They know exactly how to manipulate good people like you. They make you believe in something real, and they prey on your kindness. It's not your fault." Henry shook his head, his eyes brimming with tears. "But I should have seen it. I should have known better. All those times she asked for money, I just thought I was helping her." Jason could feel Henry's devastation like a physical weight. He wished there was something, anything he could say to make it better. But the truth was, nothing would take away the pain of realizing you had been deceived by someone you thought you loved. "You were trying to help someone you cared about," Jason said softly. "There's nothing wrong with that. You were just doing what any decent person would do." Henry's lips trembled, and he looked down at his hands, wringing them together as if trying to find some comfort in the repetitive motion. I thought she was the one. I thought I had found someone who cared about me." Jason's chest tightened. He understood all too well how powerful that kind of hope could be, especially for someone who had been alone for so long. Henry had clung to the belief that he had found love again, and now that hope had been torn away from him. "I know," Jason said quietly, "and it's okay to feel hurt right now. But you're not alone in this, Henry. You still have people who care about you." Henry glanced up at Jason, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Like who? I don't have anyone left. My wife's been gone for years. My kids, they don't visit anymore. Emily was all I had." Jason felt a pang of sympathy. The isolation Henry felt was palpable, and it reminded Jason of the conversations he had had with his own mother about loneliness. It was a feeling that could consume someone, driving them to seek out any form of connection, even if it wasn't real. "You've got me," Jason said softly, "and I'm not going anywhere." Henry's face crumpled at those words, and he lowered his head, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. Jason sat beside him, his hand resting on Henry's shoulder, offering silent comfort as the old man wept. It was a long time before Henry finally spoke again. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hoarse from crying. Jason sighed, glancing toward the exit where the authorities had taken the scammers. "Well, the police are handling the scammers. They'll face charges for what they did. And as for your money, we'll do everything we can to help you recover some of it. But I won't lie to you, it's going to take time." Henry nodded, though his expression remained bleak. "I don't care about the money," he said quietly. I just don't know how to move forward from this." "How do you come back from something like this?" Jason didn't have an easy answer for that. He knew that Henry's road to healing would be long and difficult, and it wouldn't be as simple as forgetting what had happened. The emotional scars of betrayal ran deep, and it would take time for Henry to rebuild his sense of trust and hope. "One step at a time," Jason said gently. "Well, take it slow, and you don't have to go through this alone." Henry looked at him with watery eyes, gratitude flickering in the depths of his sorrow. "Thank you, Jason. I don't know what I would have done without you." Jason felt a wave of warmth spread through his chest. In that moment, he knew that despite the pain Henry was feeling, there was still a chance for him to heal. It would take time, but Jason would be there for him every step of the way. The days that followed were difficult. Henry had retreated into himself, barely speaking and often staring blankly at his phone as if waiting for a message that would never come. Jason checked on him daily, visiting him in the small apartment where Henry lived alone. It was a modest place, filled with memories of a life that had once been full of joy and companionship. Old photographs lined the wall, pictures of Henry with his late wife, Elizabeth, their faces alight with love and laughter. There were images of family vacations, of Christmas mornings spent together, and of Henry's children when they were young. But now, those memories seemed like relics of a distant past, overshadowed by the loneliness that had consumed Henry's life since Elizabeth had passed away. Jason couldn't help but feel a deep sadness as he looked around the apartment. It was clear that Henry had once been surrounded by love, but over the years, that love had faded away. His children, busy with their own lives, had drifted apart from him, and the loss of his wife had left a gaping hole in his heart. Jason found Henry sitting by the window, staring out at the street below. His phone sat on the table beside him, the screen dark. The sense of emptiness in the room was palpable. "Hey, Henry," Jason said softly as he entered the room. "How are you feeling today?" Henry didn't look up at first, his gaze fixed on something far away. After a moment, he sighed deeply and turned to face Jason. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy with fatigue. "I just feel lost." Jason sat down across from him, his heart aching at the sight of the once proud man now so broken. "I get that. And it's okay to feel like that. What you went through, it's a lot to process." Henry nodded slowly, his eyes filling with tears again. "It's not just the scam," he said quietly. "It's everything. My life used to be so full of love, full of people. And now it's just me. I don't even know how I got here." Jason leaned forward, his voice filled with compassion. "You've had a hard life, Henry. Losing your wife, feeling disconnected from your kids, it's a lot for anyone to go through. But that doesn't mean you're alone. You still have people who care about you, and it's never too late to reconnect." Henry shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "My kids don't have time for me anymore. They've got their own lives. I'm just an afterthought." Jason could hear the pain in Henry's voice, the deep sense of abandonment that had driven him to seek out companionship online. He wanted to say something, anything that would ease Henry's pain, but he knew that words wouldn't be enough. What Henry needed was action. He needed to feel like he mattered again. "What if you called them?" Jason suggested gently. "Maybe they don't realize how much you're struggling. Sometimes people just need a reminder that you still need them." Henry looked down at his hands, wringing them together. "I don't know," he said quietly. "It's been so long, I wouldn't even know what to say." Jason smiled softly. "You don't have to say much. Just let them know you're thinking of them. Start small." For a long moment, Henry didn't respond. He seemed lost in thought, as if weighing Jason's words carefully. Finally, he nodded, though there was still a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Maybe you're right," he murmured. "Maybe it's time." Jason felt a glimmer of hope as he watched Henry consider the possibility of reconnecting with his family. It wasn't going to be easy. There was a lot of emotional distance to bridge, but it was a start. And that was all Jason could hope for right now. The following week, Jason accompanied Henry to a meeting with local investigators about the scam. It was a formal process, one that required Henry to relive the painful details of his ordeal, recounting how he had met Emily online, how their relationship had developed over 2 years, and how he had sent her his entire life savings, believing he was helping someone he loved. It was hard for Henry to talk about, and Jason could see the toll it was taking on him. But he stayed by Henry's side through it all, offering quiet support as the investigators asked their questions. They took Henry's statement, explaining that while they would do their best to recover some of his lost money, it was unlikely that he would ever see most of it again. When the meeting was over, Henry looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn. As they left the investigator's office, Jason turned to him, his voice filled with sympathy. "I know that wasn't easy," he said softly, "but you did the right thing by reporting it. You're helping make sure these people can't hurt anyone else." Henry nodded weakly, though his expression remained bleak. "It just feels like I've lost everything," he said quietly. "The money, the hope, the love I thought I had. It's all gone." Jason placed a reassuring hand on Henry's shoulder. "You haven't lost everything, Henry. You've still got a lot to live for. And you've got people who care about you, people who want to see you get back on your feet." Henry looked down at the ground, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I just don't know how to start over," he murmured. "I've spent so long believing in something that wasn't real. I don't even know who I am without it." Jason's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in Henry's voice. He understood what it was like to feel lost, to question everything you thought you knew. But he also knew that Henry was stronger than he realized. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," Jason said gently. "Take it one step at a time. You'll find your way again." Henry didn't respond right away, but Jason could see the faint glimmer of hope starting to return to his eyes. It was a small victory, but it was enough. As they walked back to the car, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for Henry's future. He had entered this situation as a security officer, just doing his job, but now it felt like something more. Henry had become a part of his life, and Jason wasn't going to abandon him in his time of need. While helping Henry navigate the aftermath of the scam, Jason couldn't ignore the growing sense of guilt that tugged at him. The conversations he had had with his mother, Margaret, kept replaying in his mind her quiet admissions of loneliness, her understanding of Henry's situation. Jason realized that while he had been so focused on helping Henry, he had neglected to fully address the loneliness in his own family. One evening, after another long day at the airport, Jason decided to visit his mother. He knew that they needed to talk, not just about Henry, but about the deeper issues that had been lingering between them for years. When Jason arrived at Margaret's house, she was sitting in her usual spot by the window, knitting a new scarf. She smiled warmly when she saw him, but there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Jason didn't usually visit without calling first. "Jason, honey, what brings you by tonight?" she asked, setting her knitting aside. Jason sat down across from her, taking a deep breath. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said softly. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversations recently, about loneliness, and how hard it can be to feel like you're disconnected from the people you care about." Margaret's smile faltered slightly, and she looked down at her hands. "It's just part of getting older, Jason. You learn to live with it. But you shouldn't have to," Jason said gently. "I've realized that I haven't been around as much as I should be. I've been so focused on my own life, on work, I didn't see how much you needed me." Margaret's eyes filled with emotion, and she shook her head. "Oh, Jason, you don't have to feel guilty. I know you're busy, and I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden, Mom," Jason said firmly. "I just didn't realize how much I was missing. And after seeing what Henry's been through, I know how important it is to stay connected to the people we love." Margaret looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm so proud of you, Jason," she whispered. "You've always had such a kind heart, and I'm grateful for every moment we spend together." Jason smiled softly, reaching out to take her hand. "I'm going to be around more, Mom. We'll spend more time together, and I'll help with whatever you need. You're not alone in this." Margaret squeezed his hand, her face filled with warmth. "Thank you, honey. That means more to me than you know." Jason stayed with his mother for the rest of the evening, helping her around the house and listening to her stories about the past. It was a quiet, peaceful night, but it felt like a step in the right direction, a step toward healing not just Henry's heart, but his own family's as well. The weeks that followed the confrontation were some of the hardest Henry had ever faced. The realization that Emily had never been real still haunted him, but with Jason's support, he began to pick up the pieces of his life. There were still moments when the grief hit him hard, days when he would sit in his small apartment, staring at his phone, wondering how he could have been so easily deceived. But he no longer felt completely alone. Jason had been a constant presence in Henry's life, visiting him regularly and encouraging him to take small steps toward healing. The sting of betrayal hadn't faded, but Henry found comfort in the fact that someone truly cared about his well-being. Jason's friendship had become a lifeline for him. One afternoon, as they sat together at a small cafe near the park, Henry seemed more at ease than Jason had seen him in weeks. He even cracked a small smile when the waitress brought him his usual cup of tea. "How are you feeling today?" Jason asked, his voice light but filled with genuine concern. Henry stirred his tea absent-mindedly, then set the spoon down with a sigh. "Better, I think. I still have bad days, but it's not as dark as it used to be." Jason smiled. "That's good. It takes time, but you're making progress." Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what you said, about reconnecting with my kids." Jason's heart lifted at the mention of it. He had been encouraging Henry to reach out to his children, to let them know that he still needed them in his life. It wasn't an easy task. Henry had grown distant from his family over the years, and the thought of mending those relationships seemed daunting. "I think it's a good idea," Jason said gently. even if it's just a phone call to start. Let them know you're thinking about them." Henry hesitated, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "What if they don't want to hear from me?" Jason leaned forward, his voice filled with reassurance. "You won't know until you try. And even if things aren't perfect right away, it's a step toward rebuilding those connections. They're your family, Henry. They'll care." Henry stared down at his tea for a long moment, lost in thought. Finally, he nodded. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time." Jason smiled, feeling a surge of pride for the old man sitting across from him. It had been a long road to this moment, but Henry was finally ready to take the first step toward healing, toward rebuilding his life. Not just from the scam, but from the years of loneliness that had preceded it. That evening, Henry sat in his living room staring at his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen, his heart pounding in his chest as he debated whether to make the call. He had spent the entire day thinking about what Jason had said, and though the fear of rejection still gnawed at him, he knew that he couldn't keep living in isolation. If there was any chance of reconnecting with his children, he had to take it. With a deep breath, Henry pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, and then there was a click as someone picked up on the other end. "Hello!" Henry's heart skipped a beat. It was his daughter, Rachel, her voice filled with the warmth and familiarity he had missed so much. "Rachel," Henry said softly, his voice trembling. "It's me. It's Dad." There was a brief pause, and Henry's heart sank, fearing that she might hang up. But then Rachel spoke again, her tone softer now. "Dad, it's been a long time. Is everything okay?" Henry closed his eyes, feeling a rush of emotions swell inside him. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I know I haven't been around much these past few years, and I've let a lot of things come between us. But I wanted to call to see how you're doing. I miss you." There was another pause, and when Rachel spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I've missed you too, Dad." For the next few minutes, father and daughter spoke, catching up on the years that had passed since they had last been close. It wasn't an easy conversation. There were unspoken hurts and misunderstandings that still lingered, but it was a start. By the time they hung up, Henry felt a sense of relief and hope that he hadn't felt in years. The next day, Henry called his son, Daniel, and had a similar conversation. While there were still barriers to overcome, Henry's willingness to reach out had opened the door to something new, a chance to rebuild his family relationships and mend the emotional wounds that had festered for so long. When Jason visited Henry a few days later, he could see the change in him. There was a lightness to his demeanor, a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. "I talked to my kids," Henry said, smiling as he sipped his tea. "It's going to take time, but I think we're on the right track." Jason's face lit up with pride. "That's amazing, Henry. I'm really happy for you." Henry nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Jason. You've been a good friend." Jason smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "I'm just glad I could help." As the weeks passed, Henry's recovery continued. He attended therapy sessions for victims of fraud, where he met others who had gone through similar experiences. It helped him to share his story, to hear from others who understood the pain of being deceived and betrayed. Slowly but surely, Henry was rebuilding his sense of self, learning to trust again, not just in other people, but in his own judgment. But it wasn't just Henry's emotional recovery that was improving. With Jason's encouragement, he had also started to explore the idea of finding companionship again. This time, though, he approached it with caution, determined not to fall into the same trap that had ensnared him before. Jason had helped Henry set up an online dating profile, this time using reputable senior dating websites that were specifically designed for older adults looking for genuine connections. Jason had walked him through the process, teaching him how to recognize the red flags that had led to his previous heartbreak. At first, Henry had been hesitant. The idea of putting himself out there again was daunting, especially after what he had been through. But as time went on, he began to feel more confident, more willing to take a chance on love again. One evening, as Jason visited Henry for their usual cup of tea, Henry brought up the subject of dating. "I've been talking to someone online," Henry said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Jason raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Really, that's great. Henry, tell me about her. Henry chuckled softly, a hint of shyness in his voice. Her name is Linda. She's a widow, like me, and we've been chatting for a few weeks now. She seems kind, thoughtful. We haven't met in person yet, but we're planning to have coffee sometime next week. Jason's heart lifted at the news. After everything Henry had been through, hearing that he was open to meeting someone new felt like a victory. That's amazing, Henry. I'm happy for you. Just take it slow and trust your instincts. If she's a good person, it'll feel right. Henry nodded, his smile growing. Yeah, I think this time I'm ready. The conversation filled Jason with hope. It wasn't just about Henry finding love again. It was about his willingness to trust and believe in the possibility of happiness. The road to recovery had been long and difficult, but Henry had come through it stronger, more resilient, and with a new sense of purpose. As Jason left Henry's apartment that evening, he couldn't help but feel proud of the man he had come to care for so deeply. Henry had faced unimaginable heartbreak, but he had emerged from the darkness with a renewed sense of hope. And in helping Henry, Jason had also grown. He had learned the importance of compassion, of being present for those who needed him most. A few weeks later, on a sunny afternoon, Jason decided to visit Henry unannounced. He had been thinking about how far Henry had come, and he wanted to check in on him before his shift at the airport. As he made his way to Henry's apartment, he stopped by a florist and picked up a bouquet of fresh roses, a symbol of new beginnings. When Jason arrived at Henry's door, he knocked softly, unsure if Henry would be home. After a moment, the door opened, and Henry greeted him with a warm smile. "Jason, what a surprise," Henry said, stepping aside to let him in. "I brought you something," Jason said, holding out the bouquet of roses. "Thought these might brighten your day." Henry's eyes softened as he took the flowers, his smile growing. "Thank you, Jason. They're beautiful." As they sat together in the living room, Henry placed the roses in a vase on the table, the vibrant red petals a stark contrast to the wilted bouquet he had once held in the airport. The sight of them filled the room with a sense of renewal, of hope reborn. "How are things going with Linda?" Jason asked, leaning back in his chair. Henry chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "We had our coffee date last week, and it went well. We're taking things slow, but I think this could be something special." Jason smiled, feeling a sense of contentment wash over him. Henry had come so far from the man who had been sitting alone in the airport, waiting for someone who would never arrive. He had found a new sense of purpose, a new connection, and the possibility of love once again. As they sat in comfortable silence, Jason glanced over at the roses, their bright petals a symbol of the journey Henry had taken. It hadn't been easy. There had been heartbreak, betrayal, and moments of deep sorrow, but in the end, Henry had found his way back to hope. And as for Jason, he knew that this experience had changed him too. He had learned the value of compassion, of standing by someone even when the path ahead seemed dark. He had reconnected with his own family, deepening his relationship with his mother, and recognizing the importance of staying close to the people he loved. As Jason prepared to leave, he turned to Henry with a smile. "I'm proud of you, Henry. You've come a long way." Henry looked at him with gratitude, his eyes filled with warmth. "I couldn't have done it without you, Jason. You saved me." Jason shook his head, his voice filled with humility. "No, Henry, you saved yourself. I was just here to help." As Jason stepped out into the warm afternoon sun, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that both he and Henry had found something precious in the midst of their struggle, hope, love, and the strength to keep moving forward. As Jason left Henry's apartment, the sun casting a golden glow over the city, he felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. He had witnessed Henry's transformation from a man trapped in despair to someone ready to embrace life again. If you've enjoyed this heartwarming story about hope and second chances, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can stay tuned for more stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us all of the power of kindness and resilience. And if you know someone who might need a story like this in their life, make sure to share it with them too. Linda gestured toward the door, and a moment later, Chloe Johnson, now 10 years old, walked in, followed closely by her parents, Mark and Sarah Johnson. Chloe's smile was as bright as ever, and she rushed over to Ethan, throwing her arms around him in a spontaneous hug. "Mr. King," she exclaimed, "Mom and Dad said I could come see the center." Ethan chuckled, returning the hug. "Chloe, you're always welcome here. How's school going?" Chloe beamed. "It's great. I got an A on my art project." "That's amazing," Ethan said, his heart swelling with pride for the young girl who had inspired him to change his ways all those months ago. "I'm sure it's well-deserved." As Chloe wandered off to explore the center with Linda, Mark and Sarah approached Ethan, their faces filled with warmth and gratitude. "Ethan, we just wanted to stop by and say thank you," Mark said, his voice sincere. "We've been following everything you've been doing here, and it's incredible. You've made such a difference, not just in this community, but in so many lives." Sarah nodded in agreement. "You've built something that will last, something that will continue to help people long after we're gone." "That's a real legacy, Ethan." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to their words. It wasn't the first time he had been thanked for his work, but coming from Mark and Sarah, the very people he had once wronged, it meant more than he could ever put into words. "You both gave me a second chance when you didn't have to," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I've done since then, it's because of the grace you showed me. You'll never be able to thank you enough for that." Mark smiled, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We all deserve a second chance, Ethan, and you've made the most of yours." As they stood together in the heart of the community center, surrounded by the very people whose lives had been touched by the foundation, Ethan realized just how far he had come. He had once measured his worth by his wealth, his status, and his ability to control the world around him. But now he understood that true wealth wasn't about material possessions. It was about the relationships you built, the lives you changed, and the compassion you showed to others. This was the legacy he would leave behind, a legacy of kindness, of growth, of redemption. And as Chloe's laughter echoed through the halls of the center, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He had found his purpose, and in doing so, he had found himself. A year had passed since the opening of the new community center, and Ethan's life had taken on a new kind of rhythm, grounded in service, connection, and purpose. The foundation had grown exponentially, with new partnerships and programs reaching even more people in need. But for Ethan, the real success was seeing the lives that had been transformed by the work they were doing. One afternoon, Ethan sat in his office, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had once been consumed by ambition, driven by the desire to climb higher and higher in the world of business. But now his ambitions had shifted. His success was no longer measured by dollars and deals, but by the smiles on the faces of the people he had helped, by the stories of resilience and triumph that filled the halls of the center. As he looked out the window, watching the community bustle with life, Ethan's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Richard Blackwell, who had recently become one of the foundation's biggest donors and had even started volunteering at the center himself. "Hey, Ethan, just wanted to let you know that we reached our fundraising goal for the scholarship program. I've got some ideas for expanding it even further. Let's talk soon." Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of pride in Richard's transformation. He had once been Ethan's greatest critic, but now he was one of the Foundation's most passionate advocates. It was proof that change was possible for anyone, no matter how set in their ways they might be. As the day drew to a close, Ethan left the office and made his way to the community garden behind the Centera project that had been started by some of the families in the neighborhood. The garden was a peaceful, thriving space where people came together to grow fresh produce, share meals, and support one another. Ethan wandered through the rows of plants, his heart full of gratitude for the journey he had taken. He had once been lost in a world of arrogance and entitlement, but now he had found something far more valuable than wealth or power. He had found a sense of belonging, a purpose that went beyond himself. As he stood in the garden, watching the sun set over the city, Ethan thought about the future of the foundation, the future of the community, and the future of the people whose lives they would continue to touch. It was a future filled with hope, a future built on the lessons he had learned about compassion, humility, and grace. And for the first time in his life, Ethan King knew that he had finally found true success. As the foundation entered its second year of expansion, Ethan found himself settling into a role he had never imagined for himself: a mentor, a leader, and a champion for others. The community center had grown beyond anyone's expectations, and the ripple effect of its success was evident in every corner of the neighborhood. New businesses were opening, families were thriving, and the once-neglected area was blossoming. Yet even with all the progress, Ethan knew there was still more work to be done. One afternoon, as he sat in a quiet corner of the community center's cafe, he received a text from Alex Jackson, the young man who had become one of the foundation's most dedicated volunteers. "Hey, Mr. King, can we talk? I've got an idea I want to run by you." Ethan smiled as he read the message. He had watched Alex grow from a skeptical outsider to a passionate advocate for the foundation's mission. And now Alex was a key player in many of the center's initiatives. "Sure, meet me in the cafe when you have time," Ethan texted back, curious about what Alex had in mind. Not long after, Alex entered the cafe, his energy as vibrant as ever. He carried a notebook filled with scribbles and diagrams, and his eyes gleamed with excitement. "Mr. King, I've been thinking," Alex began, sliding into the seat across from Ethan. "We've done a lot of great work here, but I think there's something missing a piece that could make a huge difference." Ethan leaned forward, intrigued. "Tell me more." Alex flipped open his notebook, revealing a series of sketches and notes. "I've been talking to some of the kids who come to the center after school. A lot of them are passionate about technology, coding, gaming, robotics, but they don't have the resources to explore those interests. What if we started a tech lab, a place, where they could learn coding, build their own projects, and maybe even get involved in local tech competitions?" Ethan's eyes lit up as he considered the idea. He had seen firsthand how important it was to provide opportunities for young people to explore their interests and develop new skills. A tech lab could open doors for kids in the community doors that might otherwise remain closed. "That's an incredible idea, Alex," Ethan said, genuinely impressed. "I think it could be a game changer for a lot of these kids. We'd need to figure out the logistics, but I'm all in." Alex grinned, clearly relieved by Ethan's enthusiasm. "I knew you'd like it. I've already reached out to a few people who might be able to help us get the equipment and software we need." Ethan nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The tech lab could be the next big step in the Foundation's evolution. And it was exactly the kind of initiative that aligned with the Foundation's mission of empowering people through education and opportunity. "Let's set up a meeting next week," Ethan said. "We'll get Mark and Linda involved, and we can start planning how to make this happen." As they wrapped up their conversation, Ethan felt a surge of pride, not just in Alex's growth, but in the Foundation as a whole. It had become a place where people could dream big, where new ideas were embraced, and where anyone, regardless of their background, could find the support they needed to succeed. The tech lab was just the beginning. Later that evening, Ethan returned home to his modest apartment, a far cry from the luxurious penthouse he had once called home. His new space was simple, comfortable, and a reflection of the life he had built since his transformation. He no longer needed the trappings of wealth to feel fulfilled. Instead, his joy came from the work he was doing and the people he was helping. As he sat down at his desk, Ethan picked up an old framed photograph, the one he had taken from his former life. It was a picture of him standing in front of his former company's headquarters, dressed in a designer suit, his arms folded confidently as he stared into the camera. The man in the photo looked powerful, successful, and in control. But now, as Ethan looked at the image, he saw someone else, a man who had been lost, consumed by pride, and completely disconnected from what truly mattered. He had come so far since that time. The arrogance, the entitlement, the need to prove himself, it had all faded away, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude for the second chance he had been given. The journey hadn't been easy, and there had been moments of doubt, but every step had brought him closer to the person he was meant to be. Ethan placed the photo back on his desk, a symbol of his past and a reminder of how far he had come. His transformation hadn't been the result of one single event. It had been a process one that had required him to confront his own flaws, to make amends for his mistakes, and to embrace the values of compassion and humility. As Ethan stared out the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, he thought about the people who had helped him along the way. Mark, Linda, Alex, Jordan, and even Richard. Each of them had played a role in his transformation, and each of them had shown him the power of grace. It was a lesson Ethan would carry with him for the rest of his life. The Tech Lab project gained momentum quickly. Within a few months, the foundation had secured funding from local tech companies, and volunteers from across the city came forward to help set up the lab. The excitement from the kids was contagious. They couldn't wait to start coding, building robots, and exploring the world of technology. As the grand opening of the Tech Lab approached, Ethan found himself reflecting on his role within the foundation. He had become a key figure in the organization's growth, but as the foundation expanded and new leaders emerged, Ethan began to wonder if it was time to pass the torch. One afternoon, as Ethan and Mark walked through the new Tech Lab, watching volunteers install computers and set up equipment, Ethan broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind. "Mark, I've been thinking," Ethan began, his tone thoughtful. "The foundation is in a great place now, and with the Tech Lab and the new programs, I think it's time for me to take a step back." Mark stopped in his tracks, turning to face Ethan with a puzzled expression. "What do you mean, take a step back? You've been instrumental in everything we've done here. Why would you want to leave now?" Ethan shook his head. "I'm not leaving, not entirely. I just think it's time for the next generation to take the lead. People like Alex, they've got the passion and the vision to take the foundation even further. I want to make sure they have the space to grow into those roles." Mark studied Ethan for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I see what you're saying. You've always been good at seeing the bigger picture." Ethan smiled. "I've had good teachers." Mark chuckled, clapping Ethan on the back. "Well, if you're serious about stepping back, we'll have to figure out what that looks like. But I get it. You've been leading by example, and now it's time to let others lead too." As they continued their walk through the lab, Ethan felt a sense of peace. He wasn't stepping away from the foundation, he was simply transitioning into a new role, one that would allow others to rise to the occasion. He had built something lasting, and now he was ready to trust the people around him to carry it forward. The grand opening of the Tech Lab was a resounding success. The local media covered the event, highlighting the foundation's commitment to providing young people with the skills they needed to thrive in a rapidly changing world. Families from all over the city attended, eager to see what the lab had to offer. As Ethan watched Alex give a speech about the importance of technology in education and the opportunities the lab would provide, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. Alex had come so far, and now he was stepping into a leadership role that would shape the future of the foundation. After the event, Alex approached Ethan, a look of determination in his eyes. "Mr. King, I just want to thank you for everything. You believed in me when no one else did, and now I feel like I can really make a difference here." Ethan smiled, placing a hand on Alex's shoulder. "You already are making a difference, Alex, and I couldn't be prouder of you." A few months after the grand opening of the Tech Lab, Ethan received an unexpected invitation or request to speak at an upcoming conference on philanthropy and community leadership. The invitation came from one of his former business rivals, someone who had once viewed Ethan's shift toward nonprofit work with skepticism, but had since come to admire the foundation's success. At first, Ethan was hesitant. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, and the idea of addressing an audience full of wealthy business leaders felt daunting. But as he thought about it, he realized that this was an opportunity to share his story, to show others that change was possible, even for someone as deeply entrenched in the world of wealth and power as he had once been. When the day of the conference arrived, Ethan stood backstage, waiting for his turn to speak. He could hear the hum of conversation from the crowd, a mix of corporate executives, nonprofit leaders, and community advocates. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him, but he knew that this was an important step in his journey. As Ethan stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, others not, and took a deep breath. "Good afternoon," Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "A few years ago, I stood where many of you stand today. I was at the top of my game, running a successful business, measuring my worth by the size of my bank account and the deals I made. But I was wrong. I was missing something important." Ethan paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "It took a moment of humiliation and a lesson in grace to show me that real success isn't about wealth or power. It's about how we treat others. It's about the impact we have on the lives of the people around us."
As he spoke, Ethan shared the story of his transformation, his encounter with the Johnson family, the foundation's work, and the personal growth he had experienced along the way.
He talked about the importance of second chances, of forgiveness, and of using one's resources to lift others up instead of pushing them down. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, and Ethan felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. He had shared his truth, and in doing so, he had offered others the opportunity to reflect on their own lives and the choices they were making. As he left the stage, Ethan knew that this was his final act of grace, a chance to inspire others to follow the path he had taken. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the legacy of compassion and kindness that he had helped build. Thank you for following Ethan's story, a tale of redemption, leadership, and the power of second chances. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay connected. I'm working on more heartwarming stories just like this one, and your support helps me keep sharing these meaningful journeys with you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how this story resonated with you. Together, we can continue to explore stories of transformation, hope, and the impact of kindness. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. Over the course of the semester, Ryan shared not just the victories he'd had in his career, but the hard lessons he had learned along the way. He emphasized the importance of empathy, listening, and above all, the responsibility that comes with the badge. Teaching gave Ryan a new outlet for his energy and passion. It wasn't the adrenaline-filled, high-stakes work of policing, but it was just as important. These students were the future, and he was determined to equip them with the tools they needed to lead with integrity. While Ryan was settling into his new role as an educator, Jordan Thompson's star continued to rise. His work on the national level had gained him a reputation as one of the most respected voices in the fight for justice reform. Jordan had helped pass landmark legislation that put ethical limits on the use of surveillance technology, created national standards for police accountability, and expanded community-led safety programs across the country. One afternoon, Jordan called Ryan from his office in Washington, D.C., and with some unexpected news. "Ryan, guess what?" Jordan said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "They want me to run for office." Ryan chuckled. "Who's they? And what office are we talking about here?" Jordan laughed. "A group of people who've been following my work think I should run for Congress. They want me to take this fight from the courtroom to the Capitol." Ryan wasn't entirely surprised. Jordan had always been a fighter, and he had the kind of charisma and conviction that made him a natural leader. "I can't say I didn't see this coming. Are you thinking about it?" "I am," Jordan admitted. "It's a huge responsibility, but I've been thinking about how much more we could accomplish with the right people in power. If I can push for change at the highest level, why not go for it?" Ryan nodded, though Jordan couldn't see it. "You've always said we need people inside the system to change it from within. This might be your chance to do just that." "I've been thinking the same thing," Jordan replied. "It's a big step, but I think it's the right one." As they talked, Ryan felt a deep sense of pride for his friend. Jordan had spent his life fighting for justice, and now he was on the verge of taking that fight to the national stage. The following year, Jordan launched his campaign for Congress. With his years of legal experience and his proven track record in reform, he quickly gained support from a wide range of voters. His platform focused on criminal justice reform, civil rights, and economic equality issues that had been central to his work for decades. Ryan, though retired, was actively involved in the campaign, offering advice and helping Jordan connect with key community leaders. He traveled with Jordan to campaign events, standing by his side as they continued to push for the changes they had always believed in. On the night of the election, Ryan sat in the campaign's headquarters, surrounded by Jordan's team, watching the results roll in. The energy in the room was electric, but Ryan remained calm, reflecting on everything they had accomplished together. When the final votes were tallied, it was official: Jordan had won the election. The room erupted into cheers, and Jordan was immediately swarmed by supporters and media. But as soon as he had a moment, Jordan made his way through the crowd to Ryan. "We did it, man," Jordan said, grinning from ear to ear. Ryan smiled, shaking his friend's hand before pulling him into a hug. "You did it! I'm proud of you." Jordan nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "None of this would have happened without you, Ryan. We've been in this together from the start." As the celebration continued, Ryan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something even bigger. Jordan's election to Congress meant that the work they had started years ago, the fight for justice, fairness, and accountability, was now being carried forward on a national level. And while Ryan was stepping back, he knew that the movement would continue to grow, led by people like Jordan, who were ready to take the next steps. As Ryan watched Jordan deliver his victory speech later that night, he felt a sense of closure and fulfillment. The work they had done together had made a lasting impact, not just in their city, but across the country. They had faced countless obstacles, but through it all, they had never given up. Ryan's life was quieter now, but it was filled with meaning. His time teaching at the university continued to bring him joy, and the students he mentored were already starting to make waves in the fields of law enforcement, social justice, and community activism. His influence would live on through them, and through the work Jordan was doing on a national scale. In the end, Ryan realized that the fight for justice never truly ended. It was passed down from one generation to the next, evolving with each new challenge. But he took comfort in knowing that the work would continue long after he was gone. And as he looked toward the future, Ryan Carter was filled with hope that the lessons they had learned, the battles they had fought, and the progress they had made would lead to a world that was fairer, more just, and filled with opportunity for all. As the story draws to a close, we want to thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of justice, friendship, and change. If you enjoyed this story and want more thought-provoking content like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, challenge, and make a difference. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and what impact this story had on you. Subscribe now for more impactful stories and content that makes you think. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.